Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a todos y a todas las participantes. Voy a empezar a hablar en español porque tengo el privilegio de poder expresarme en mi lengua materna, pero después de un ratito cambiaré a inglés para que tengan tiempo también de ajustar sus audífonos. Yo me llamo Dafna Feinholz, soy mexicana, pero estoy desde hace 13 años trabajando en la UNESCO. Soy la jefa de la sección de bioética y ética de la ciencia y tecnología, y por eso es que me hicieron el favor de invitarme para coordinar este panel. Me imagino que se preguntarán ustedes por qué estamos hablando de inteligencia artificial en un foro en el que se habla sobre racismo y discriminación, cuando hemos escuchado tantas cosas, por ejemplo, el rol de la sociedad civil, el rol de los gobiernos, el rol que los diferentes actores tienen, y hemos hablado de muchos espacios en donde esto se puede no solamente corregir, sino de alguna manera usar como medios para avanzar agendas como son el arte. Lo vimos con la música, lo vimos con la escritura. Entonces, bueno, no podríamos tener un foro completo para hablar sobre discriminación y racismo si no hiciéramos también alusión a lo que son las nuevas tecnologías, las tecnologías digitales y muy en particular la inteligencia artificial. ¿Y por qué? ¿Por qué especialmente preocuparnos por la inteligencia artificial? Hay muchas definiciones de inteligencia artificial y yo no quiero dar ahorita, ese no es el objetivo del panel, hacer una cátedra de qué es, pero quiero decirles por qué es que es un tema tan importante. Porque se trata de unos sistemas, la inteligencia artificial son sistemas que tienen la capacidad de procesar datos e información de una manera que es muy similar a la de los seres humanos. Y eso implica que pueden tener, o sea, implica procedimientos que son razonamiento, que son aprendizaje, que son percepción, que son predicción, y por lo tanto se están utilizando para tomar muchas decisiones actualmente. Entonces, si se dan cuenta, es casi como si estuviéramos hablando de una persona. Y si estamos hablando de unos sistemas que pueden tener un alcance tan importante como lo que estamos diciendo, quiere decir que tenemos que ser muy cuidadosos con cómo se utilizan y que tenemos que hacer una reflexión de cuál es el uso que le damos. Entonces, hace un año, justamente en noviembre, la UNESCO adoptó un documento que es la Recomendación de Ética en Inteligencia Artificial, que fue adoptada por aclamación por 193 países. Esto es un hecho histórico por varias razones, porque es un tema muy sensible, con bastantes aristas políticas, con bastantes intereses, por ejemplo, del sector privado, y logramos un consenso de 193 países, como les digo, para adoptar esta recomendación. Ahora sí, voy a pasar a inglés. So now I'm switching to English, and so I just want to say that why did UNESCO decided to go ahead with this recommendation? First of all, UNESCO is very well known because of many programs, like the most famous one is the World Heritage, but UNESCO does a lot of things as well, and it has a very strong program on bioethics and ethics of science and technology, and it has a very important role in normative, as a normative agency, and we have different declarations, for example, on bioethics and human rights, ethics of climate change, and so that's why, because of the importance of these technologies, member states gave the mandate to UNESCO to elaborate this recommendation in order to ensure that there is a global framework and that is based on global ethical values agreed by the whole community that will allow to establish legal frameworks to ensure that artificial intelligence that we can protect from harms from artificial intelligence, but at the same time harness for the benefits of this technology. And the idea is to have these very sound legal frameworks. It is also historical because it's the first document that is negotiated and adopted in 2-year times. Normally it's 4. And it was during the pandemics, so you can imagine that it was super hard work. And I'm really very proud to be the head of a fantastic team that worked. And in Spanish, we say de sol a sol, meaning 24 hours on the clock, to finish this work in very difficult conditions. On the time, of course, in close coordination and hand in hand with our ADG, Gabriela Ramos. So why is it so important? First of all, because there are many, since artificial intelligence started to become so important, there were a lot of documents that started to be produced by many organisms. But each of those are, first of all, either regional or have a different motivation or starting point. So one of the most important advantages and importance of this document is the first true global one. 193 countries instead of 20-something or 50-something in other organizations. Most importantly, including the Global South, which are the ones who are basically excluded from many of other regional ones. And this goes hand in hand with multiculturalism and in different ways of legislating and looking at the world. The other difference that makes this document so important is that it's the only one that is based on ethics, because the starting point of many other documents is, for example, economical growth or policy making, but this one, although it is also trying to ensure and do not go against economical growth, and it's towards having proper legal frameworks and governance mechanisms, but it's based on ethics. What we want to achieve is that these legal frameworks will be ethical. And I will go in a minute to explain what ethics means in this and what does it mean, ethics, for us in this document. Now, another very important thing to tell you is about the recommendation is that it takes into account the whole life cycle of the AI, from when it's thought about, when it's conceived, when it's developed, when it's implemented, and also what impact it has, and then also if you decide to terminate using this technology. And it's very important, and it's clearly stated in the document, that multiculturalism, respect for diversity, cultural diversity, should be ensured during the whole life cycle. So you start, I hope, to start seeing one of the first links that we have with the recommendation. Another important feature is that this recommendation puts the human in the first place, all the time in the loop. It doesn't provide AI agency. There is no way AI can be accountable. It's always a human that will be accountable. So it's, I think, another important feature of the recommendation. So what does it mean, ethics? Ethics means a systematic and dynamic reflection of what are the impacts of the technologies on life. So we know that artificial intelligence evolves, develops, changes. We can already know some of the potential harms, but probably they will, or benefits, but we can also have new ones as the technology evolves. So the ethical reflection, the reflection of what do we want these technologies, where do we want these technologies to go, needs to accompany all the time the development of the technology. And who are the ones who have to reflect and decide which is the limit of technology? Well, everyone that will be affected by it. So as you can see, so it's policymakers, it's developers, it's civil society as a whole, so it's each one of us in the society. So as you can see, ethics is about inclusiveness and diversity as well. Very quickly, I just want also to say that this document was done in a very inclusive way because it was elaborated after very broad consultations, both online and regional consultations. And the first draft was done by individual experts that came from very different backgrounds. From academia, from NGOs, from scientists, from philosophy, etc., and from all the regions of the world to ensure this diversity. And the consultations were exactly the same. And Maria Elena here, she just told me that she participated in the one that we held in Latin America. And then it went to the negotiations with the member states. And I just wanted to tell you that we got just online 50,000 comments for the recommendation. So it was again also produced in a very inclusive way. So this recommendation has values. These values are the ones who are, that inspire the inspiration of behaviors. And there are 4 values, but the third one is ensuring diversity and inclusiveness. This is the third of the 4 values of the recommendation. And then those values are spelled out in different principles. And these principles then, which is one of the beauty of the recommendation, are then declined in or are translated into concrete policy recommendations. And the last thing is that these, and it's not only concrete policy recommendations in all the areas of work of UNESCO, meaning education, culture, science, natural sciences, human and social sciences, and health and well-being, for example. And it's also very strong in terms of gender transformative language and perspective across the whole document. And it has 2 concrete tools to be implemented: the readiness assessment methodology and the ethical impact assessment. And member states need to report to UNESCO every 4 years how they are in implementing this the recommendation. So I think I spoke too much, but I thought it was important to let you know what this document is about. Because now I will be introducing the fantastic panel that we have. Our panelists are great, and I'm really grateful that they are joining. We are a very balanced panel, very diverse in our backgrounds. Because not all of us are also in presence, but also in virtual, and we are gender balanced, even if in a binary perspective. But most important, everyone is really an expert. So let me introduce them before I go to the questions. We will have 2 rounds of questions, 5 minutes for each speaker, for each round, and the third round will be, I will be asking every speaker to provide us with a specific concrete action on how to move forward. And then after, I hope we will have also time for questions and comments from you from the floor. So let me introduce you first Ames Dai, Professor of Bioethics and Health Law at the University of Wits in South Africa. Sorry, Ames, but I will not be able to pronounce correctly the name of your university. We have, and she's also the chair of the UNESCO's International Bioethics Committee. Peter Paul Verbeek, Rector Magnificus and Professor of Philosophy, Ethics, Science and Technology at the University of Amsterdam in Netherlands. And he's the chair of the World Commission of Science and Technology at UNESCO. Guillermo Canella, a dear colleague, he's the Chief of Section of Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists at UNESCO at the sector of communication. Karel Frakapan here, who is also a program specialist and focal point for hate speech at the education sector. Emma Wright, director and founder of the Institute of AI in the United Kingdom. And Elena Estavillo, founder and CEO of Centro-i for Society of Future from Mexico. So with this introduction, and fantastic panelists. I will start then with the concrete questions. I think first I would like all of us to address racism and discrimination in and offline. So we know that these are not new phenomena. Racism and discrimination continue to be pervasive issues in modern society, as we have seen during this day and a half, and they are found both in offline and online spaces, and they take various forms. Sometimes these forms are visible. They are often transformed in online spaces, but sometimes in hidden and opaque algorithms. So countering and preventing these issues constitutes a real challenge. So Emma, can you please give us in more details and explain how racism and discrimination can be embedded in AI, please?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the organisers and for my invitation to speak. I'm honoured to be speaking to you all this afternoon. So I come from this as a lawyer, a policymaker, and a technologist. I'm not an expert in AI, but what I try and do is bring technology down to a very simple level so that people can understand it who don't spend their time studying these areas. And really, AI, artificial intelligence, is very, very complicated maths in that sense, from that perspective. And so what happens is that to train the AI, a lot of data is used. And so if we look at the data sets that we've built, we're building far more recently, but our data sets there are a lot of people that have been missed out of those data sets. So from a sample perspective, lots of people in this room wouldn't be included in those samples. From my perspective, there will be various judgments made on me and my role as a woman that doesn't necessarily fulfill, a profession that I'm following. And so when you're training your AI and you're feeding data into it, a bias can appear depending on what sits within the data set. And also you might have training data, and if someone's just created that training data, they won't necessarily have thought. So for anyone who wants to talk to me about this later, on my Twitter profile, I've just pinned it. I put my picture through some facial recognition about 3 years ago, and it told you what your profession was, and it came up as an air stewardess. Now, the Chinese man behind me was recognized as a cog, so he wasn't even determined to be a person. But that gives you a sense of how these tools allow for judgments to be made without us being aware, because where we are heading is that AI allows governments to do more with less, and they will become more pervasive. So we might not realize that these decisions are being taken. The other thing, so that's kind of one example of bias. A second one is around when the product's being developed, the features that it will have. So when I speak on this, you can't tell, but I'm actually left-handed. In the UK, it's okay to be left-handed. They stopped tying hands behind our back about 50 years ago. There isn't one ticket machine in the whole of the London Underground that is set for a left-handed person. Now, the reason I use that example is because actually it's one that transcends everyone and people can relate to. And being left-handed isn't a new thing, but that gives you a sense of if I was less able-bodied, how I might struggle with that. But there will be features that might, if people aren't involved and a true representative of those that might use it, how they would be, receive bias or be discriminated against. And then the final one is how tools can become more discriminatory in their application. So there was an example of a chatbot that Microsoft used, and the racist language that it was fed to it made it more racist. And where we are is that this technology is currently being rolled out without people really being able to scrutinize and understand, and it's nudging us and driving behaviors, and we don't necessarily know the basis of the decisions and the nudges it's making. There are other examples around a loan application that Apple put out, and it was providing loans more successfully to men than women. There are lots and lots of examples, and that's where the bias comes from. There are some countries that are bringing in laws and requiring equal opportunities commissions to look at the algorithms and to be sure that they aren't discriminatory, but that's where we are with the bias. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. Now I will turn to Maria Elena, because I think you will have also things to add or to go more into details about the different sources of bias that we have.
Sí.
Sí, en español, sí. Iba a hacerte la pregunta en español, de hecho.
Está muy bien. Gracias. Sí, pues coincidimos en esta atención sobre el tema de los datos, porque finalmente esta es parte del ciclo de vida de la inteligencia artificial, ¿no? Se requieren datos para que las máquinas aprendan, ¿no? Para generar este proceso de aprendizaje y de toma de decisiones. Y pues la primera reflexión es que a veces pensamos que los datos son neutrales, son objetivos, hablamos mucho de los datos brutos, el dato duro, pero la verdad es que no existe eso. Todos los datos contienen distintos tipos de sesgos que están relacionados con su ciclo de vida. Y aquí me gustaría señalar, ¿a qué me refiero? Desde pensar qué es lo que estamos midiendo, desde ahí qué elegimos medir y qué no medimos. Ahí hay decisiones de a qué se dedica el esfuerzo y los recursos para generar estadísticas y datos. Hay otros que simplemente surgen del uso, ¿no? De las tecnologías, todo lo que se deriva de, por ejemplo, las plataformas digitales, de las redes sociales, pero eso también tiene que ver con el acceso que tienen las personas a las tecnologías, y no todos tenemos el mismo acceso, y ahí también se generan, es otra fuente de sesgos. Luego vamos a las formas en las que medimos. Es el mismo concepto de los indicadores, qué criterios se priorizan, cuáles son la regularidad, hasta dónde los hacemos representativos de la población, qué se queda afuera. Siempre se quedan afuera cosas sin medir, y qué elegimos dejar adentro y qué se queda afuera. ¿Qué se promedia también? ¿Qué tan amplios son los universos de donde sacamos indicadores? Y si vamos promediando o volviendo regulares cosas que en realidad no lo son y que merecen una atención específica. Y también cómo nos acercamos a los fenómenos. Cuando se trata de encuestas, cuando recogemos la información que está en el ciberespacio, ¿qué hay detrás? ¿Qué genera la reflexión? ¿Cómo se pregunta a la gente? ¿A quién se le pregunta? ¿En qué momento se le pregunta? ¿O en qué momento tiene esta oportunidad para pues dejar ver sus preferencias, sus opiniones, sus datos personales, sociodemográficos? Y ahí voy a la reflexión de qué nos hace falta para integrar estas bases de datos que vamos a utilizar para que la inteligencia artificial aprenda. Entonces tenemos que asegurarnos que tenga datos que sirvan, porque si no vamos a estar introduciendo todos estos sesgos que se reflejan de nuestra interacción humana. La inteligencia artificial no los crea, los refleja, los amplifica, que esta sí es una parte preocupante, pero surgen de la interacción humana. Y así como surgen, entonces eso quiere decir que tenemos que hacer esfuerzos conscientes, deliberados, para quitar estos sesgos, para compensar lo que no estamos viendo. Y para ello tenemos, por ejemplo, el concepto de datos de género, tener datos desagregados, y así como lo tenemos enfocado al género, pues también enfocado a los temas raciales, de origen étnico, las diferencias entre los países, entre las regiones, los grupos en diferentes situaciones de vulnerabilidad. Y no significa solamente desagregar, esto es una parte, pero también es para que reflejen los datos las cuestiones que atañen de forma particular a todos los grupos, que se usen conceptos, definiciones que estén diseñados para capturar esas distintas realidades y que no introduzcan sesgos en el mismo concepto de los datos. Y que tomen en cuenta todos los factores culturales, los estereotipos que van incidiendo en la manera en la que se generan estos datos. Eso significa entonces pues un ciclo de vida amplísimo en donde hay que incidir, donde hay que trabajar para hacerlos incluyentes, en donde buscar la información, la falta de representatividad en las bases de datos, asegurarnos que estén todos los actores, todos los usuarios. Y a veces también considerar la posibilidad que necesitemos medir de manera específica para ciertos grupos de la población y no estar promediando y escondiendo las necesidades particulares de ciertos grupos en estas grandes bases de datos. Tener contexto, considerar quién procesa, quién recolecta, quién interpreta los datos. Tomar en cuenta también que cuando vamos a la fuente de la información estamos las humanas, los humanos, que no siempre decimos la verdad, no siempre tenemos información completa, tenemos nuestros propios sesgos, nuestras propias percepciones, y eso también se traslada a los datos. Y además, no olvidar que el lenguaje es una fuente importantísima también para el aprendizaje de la inteligencia artificial, y el lenguaje codifica sesgos. No hay que tomarlo tampoco como algo totalmente neutral. Y terminaría simplemente con una reflexión también de que los datos nos codifican el pasado, la historia. Y también en el diseño de inteligencia artificial tenemos que plantearnos si queremos reproducir la historia o si la queremos cambiar.
Muchísimas gracias, María Elena. Creo que estas dos primeras ponentes han puesto el dedo sobre la llaga de cuestiones muy claras de la vinculación del tema de nuestro foro, de la discriminación y el racismo, cómo se puede meter, cómo se puede transmitir en la inteligencia artificial, y cómo la inteligencia artificial puede hacer que estos fenómenos no solamente se perpetúen, sino que inclusive se agraven. Y entonces preguntas tan claves como ¿quién decide qué es lo que se mide? ¿Quién decide y quién define, por ejemplo, desde si soy zurdo o si pertenezco a una etnia? ¿Y qué decido medir y qué no medir? Son cuestiones fundamentales. Muchísimas gracias por esto. I will turn now to Peter Paul. Peter Paul, could you give us please a concrete example of a recent case in which ethical guidance could have helped avoid discriminatory outcomes? Can you hear us, Peter Paul? I see you are a bit perplexed.
Sorry, Daphne. No, I couldn't hear you unless until the moment that I heard you call my name. Sorry that I couldn't hear you. Thank you. Yeah, maybe I could take the discussion a little bit into the politics of the AI systems themselves. I think we've been speaking a lot about how humans, users, can be represented, which is a very important aspect of it. But I also think it's important that we learn to read, as it were, how there is an ethics in these systems themselves, even though it might sound weird to speak about technologies and ethical or even in some kind of political terms. I think the reason that AI is so important for UNESCO is that AI has an impact on our minds. I think that's maybe the main message of all the work that we are doing at UNESCO on AI. Starting from this famous founding statement of UNESCO, which says something like, since wars start in the minds of men and women, foundations for peace can be found in the minds of men and women as well. It's all about the mind, about how we think, education, science, culture, and that's where AI systems work on. They work on our minds, on how we read the world, how we understand the world, and that also means that we have a specific responsibility for AI systems. And well, there are many examples, I think, in which we could show that in the ways in which AI systems work, there can be discrimination. One of the most famous fields, I think it was touched upon already by the first speaker, is image recognition, where, for instance, there can be a bias against the color of people's skin. And there's a famous system that is used by some universities to do proctoring, so to check if students take exams from their homes, if they are still behind their computers, if they are not somehow secretly looking up information somewhere or looking up a website. And these systems have very often been explained to be racist, in the sense that they discriminate against people who do not have a white skin. And the reason for this is simply that the AI was trained on people with a white skin, and that, of course, the way in which contrasts work in the images look different for people with a skin of a different color. So it means also that algorithms learn, and that we maybe should not only blame the algorithms, but also blame how they were trained. Maybe we really need to learn to educate the AI systems. And that's also how I think we should think about the ethics of AI. Ethics should not only take the role of kind of an external assessor, standing at the distance of the technologies, trying to assess if an AI system is acceptable or not. Ethics could also be guiding technology. Could try to make an inventory of the kind of impacts that a technology like an AI system has. And then to find out what the values are that are at stake in those impacts, in order not only to say, okay, if these values are at stake, we should be against the technology or in favor of the technology, but more asking ourselves, how could we include those values? First of all, in the design of the technology, could we design a proctoring system in such a way that it does not discriminate against people with a skin of color? Or could we maybe train a system in a specific way, use different cameras or whatever, different settings of the cameras? Another line could be that we do not only want to embed the values in the technology, but also in the ways in which it is implemented in society. That's also where the values are at stake. How do we implement them? Who is entitled to use the systems? In which circumstances do we use it or not? How can we somehow regulate the way in which such systems are used? So not only the technology, but also the environment of the technology is where we can work on those values. And third, it's the users themselves who can be educated, who can be equipped, as it were, to learn to read the impacts of the technologies and the values that are at stake, in order to also make sure that there is a more positive impact. So approaching the ethics of AI systems in this way is not only what you could call negative ethics, that tries to keep out what we do not want, but it can also be positive ethics. It tries to lay the foundations for what we do want. So rather than only fighting against discrimination, against racism, which is very important to do, so don't get me wrong, but instead of only doing that, we could also try to design them in such a way that they are inclusive. And that's maybe what we could learn from these nasty examples, like this proctoring software, and there are many, many other examples on the labor market, selecting new employees, the government here in the Netherlands that try to somehow profile parents who might illegally have gotten extra funding for the childcare, and then they started to stereotype on people. And there are many, many examples. If we try to design them from values rather than only from what we do not want, hopefully we can develop a world with AI systems that are much more inclusive and diverse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter Paul. I think you not only gave us a good example, a concrete example, but you also linked it indeed to ethical guidance and to a concept that we mentioned before, which is values. No? Because it's linked also to the decision who decides what goes in and why is the values. And this is where the ethics comes again into the upfront. Thank you so much. I'm going now to ask Ames. And Ames and Peter, based on your example, and Ames that are coming from South Africa, you have to know that in this forum there has been a lot of discussion about the situation of Afro-descendant people in the different parts of the world. So this has been a main topic. And South Africa, sadly, is known for its historical examples of racial exclusion and systematic discrimination, such as apartheid. And racial tensions are still present in the country today. So I want to ask you if this socio-historical context translated into AI systems and online spaces. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Daphne. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. I want to start off by saying what an honor it is to be participating in this panel today. So I can't categorically say that our socio-historical context has been transformed into the AI arena. This may be happening covertly. But what I can say is that race-based online and offline hate speech abounds in abundance in our country. Now, as one of the world's most unequal countries built on a legacy of racial segregation, South Africa's ability to navigate this transition to democracy without descending into civil war has for very long been lauded. Initially, following the first democratic election, the state worked closely with civil society actors to develop policies that emphasize diversity and inclusion, with a commitment to address the historical legacies of apartheid. However, racism continues to plague our country, with complaints of discrimination, especially hate speech, being amongst the most recorded by the South African Human Rights Commission, as has appeared in its 2021 Trend Analysis Report. Thus far, during that year, actually, there were 5,464 complaints received by the Commission, and a significant number constituted race-based hate speech. And the Commission also added in its report that despite equality courts becoming increasingly accessible, it had also experienced challenges with low levels of awareness by court functionaries and low uptake of these courts. However, despite the limited uptake, the operation of magistrates' courts in handling equality complaints proved to be essential, especially in the social media arena, where racist incidents quickly go viral. And when getting to court, the offenders are held accountable in our equality courts, and to some respect, in full view of the public sometimes. But the high number of complaints that we've had over 1 year also indicates clearly that we have not solved the legacy of apartheid and colonialism. The right to equality remains the top reported violation, with 60% of complaints in this category relating to discrimination on the basis of race. In a country where colonialism and apartheid entrenched inequality, social cohesion actually continues to deteriorate. Why? Because of poverty, hunger, unemployment, all adding to marginalization, with those that have been discriminated against in the past being continued to be discriminated. The social media and other digital communication platforms should be used to promote human rights rather than enabling the widening of inequality and dehumanization of others, as we've seen in the country. And I'm going to give you some recent incidents of racism that have continued to expose the magnitude of the problem we have in our country. Last year, a Black student at one of our South Africa's top universities had his belongings urinated on by a white student. And we saw a similar incident occurring again this year at the same university. Last year, Cricket South Africa's social justice and nation building initiative exposed years of racism experienced by players of color. Another video that went viral on social media was that of a white man repeatedly kicking a defenseless teenager in the abdomen, a Black teenager. And the incident was allegedly sparked off by the teenager and his brother reaching for sauce to pour on their hot chips at a restaurant. Earlier this year, pupils of color at a secondary school said that they felt racially targeted following a violent clash between Black and white pupils at the school. And in a video of the incident, which also went viral on social media, there were also voice notes using really defamatory language, including the K word. Now, the K word is such a derogatory language against Black Africans living in this country, a word that was used rightfully during the Afrikaner regime. I'm not going to repeat that word here. So my concern is that this form of racism that is so highly prevalent overtly can actually be transformed covertly with the use of AI, especially as we see white monopoly capital still being so predominant. And we have a government that really remains myopic to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ames. I think you just made a very clear point about how things in offline are still prevailing, and this is related to the situation of lack of access, etc., and the discrimination that it's still going on, and then how is it translated in line? And so you just made this this point very important. And I have to say that I have been a terrible moderator, because I'm just watching the watch in front of me, and we're running very short of time. So I will ask now Guillermo and Carol. We will respect you for the same time as the other speakers. But for all of us, for the next round, let's try to be shorter, because I want all of you to speak in the second round, all of you too. So Guillermo, please. So as we know that racism and discrimination are by no means new phenomena, and legal instruments to prevent and counter them do exist. Can you tell us about these instruments and how they apply to AI systems and online hate speech in particular? Because this is exactly the work that you do at UNESCO, I think.
Sure. Good afternoon for everyone there in Mexico. A pity that I'm not there with you. So greetings from Paris. And indeed, as you said, Daphne, unfortunately, at the same time we invented as human beings love, we invented hate. So those phenomena, in this case, hate speech or racism, or even other phenomena that are correlated to this and reinforce this, like disinformation or misinformation, for instance, they are not new. As these last examples that I just made, the same time we invented truth, we invented lies. So it's very important that in these kind of discussions, we try to understand the past dependence in this historic discussion and the different developments we had in the international universal system of human rights, the discussions of the international jurisprudence of the courts on human rights in dealing with this difficult, in dealing with the difficult balancing act when we need to balance different kinds of rights. So in my case here, as representing the section of freedom of expression and safety of journalists, obviously quite often we need to discuss this relationship between freedom of expression and the protection of other rights when you have cases, for instance, of hate speech, either online or offline. But as you said, and I think it's important that we understand that the founding mothers and fathers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they have thought about that. So when you look into the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration, that is precisely the article about freedom of expression, you will see that they have defined freedom of expression in a very comprehensive way. First, the article started with everyone has the right to freedom of expression. So we are talking about no discrimination here, from children to the eldest people, from all kinds of ethnicities, etc. And then when they are actually defining what freedom of expression is, they are not connecting freedom of expression only with the right to speak. Freedom of expression is defined using three verbs: the right to impart, that is the right to speak, but also the right to seek and receive. So when we look freedom of expression in this comprehensive way, we then can understand that freedom of expression is also about protecting us from this kind of damaging or harmful speech. Because when the space is flooded with racism or hate speech or disinformation and misinformation, the rights to seek and receive are being undermined. So it's not only about protecting this right to impart. So when we look into this and connect with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, where we have two other important articles, the 19 and 20, we will see again that the international legislator were very clear on the speech that are not protected by the international standards. And in the Article 20, this is very clear: propaganda for war and speech that generates an incitement to hatred, they are not protected by freedom of expression. So this seems all very legalistic, but the way that later on the courts, the international courts, have developed tools like the Rabat Plan of Action and the Rabat Threshold to identify what is really hate speech or hate speech that incited to violence, are concrete ways that we are using to understand and to do this balancing act under the umbrella of freedom of expression. And to conclude, connecting with your question on artificial intelligence, we do think that concrete elements that are, for instance, in the UNESCO recommendations, like doing risk assessments regarding how these technologies are dealing with these issues, can benefit a lot on the concrete ways that, for instance, judicial operators have been throughout these last 7 decades dealing with these kind of topics or these kind of cases, for instance, by applying the 3-part test when it relates to limitations to freedom of expression, or more recently applying the Rabat threshold on the 6 concrete steps to identify hate speech. So in a nutshell, we do think that we have a strong legal system in the universal system of human rights that we can use. Obviously, the situation is more complicated now. We have a context with the development of technology that makes this more complex, but as every speaker have already underlined before me, we can negotiate our values, the values that we have so in a very hard way try to implement at least since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So back to you, and we can further discuss in the next round.
Thank you so much, Guillermo. In fact, the work that you do is really, you are in the eye of the hurricane when it comes to hate speech on the platforms, etc. And thank you so much for this reference to international documents and all these important reflections. I will not say too much because I want to give the floor to Karel. Because we are moving now to another very important area and domain, which is education. So, Karel, we know that not all education programs against racism and discriminations are equally efficient or relevant, and few focus on long-term prevention measures. So, how can education contribute to mitigate the harmful effects of hate speech, especially in online settings?
Thank you, Daphna, for the question. I would like to first mention that education is clearly mentioned in the United Nations Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech, which was launched in 2019, and that it is seen as a tool for addressing and countering the phenomenon of hate speech. So it's really an important dimension to consider. And I would say there are two approaches to summarize to address the problem of hate speech. I mean, one, following on what Guillaume was saying, is certainly to try to stop influential people from inciting violence and hate speech through legal measures, through better regulatory frameworks, enhancing the transparency and responsibility of digital platforms, of course, a more ethical use of AI, etc., etc. And I would add to that by occupying the space also that is occupied right now by people that are fomented and inciting hatred and violence. But it's also to try to make audiences less susceptible to hate speech by somehow inoculating them against it. In other words, through prevention. And in our view, UNESCO, of course, prevention should start on the benches of schools. And definitely this is our mission. And we have, by the way, now developed a policy guidance, which is going to be the first policy guidance on hate speech, online and offline for education policymakers. This is a book that is going to come out in the coming weeks. Concretely, it means to overcome some challenges, first of all. And I would say the first challenge is to make sure that education systems do not do harm. And it may sound a bit pessimistic, but education is not a neutral space. We know it. And when it comes to racism and hate speech, less so. So it starts indeed by acknowledging the fact that education systems can be instrumentalized to serve as accelerators for hateful ideologies, promote political indoctrination and propaganda. And in most cases, of course, it's not necessarily intentional, but education systems may contribute to division and to justify forms of inclusion. So in other words, sometimes hate speech, racism, discrimination find roots in education systems themselves. So that's one point I think one should consider. And it's all the more important in the case when one considers artificial intelligence, of course, and we've just said it. I mean, there are lots of perspectives to enhance education in general with AI, but this comes with huge challenges regarding the rights of students due to the conscious or unconscious biases that may be introduced in algorithms. And the second, I mean, that's also another point that Guillaume has raised. I mean, AI contributes to political polarization via digital platforms, to radicalization, to the dissemination of hate speech, and learners should indeed be given the tools to understand these mechanisms. So here the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence definitely provides an extremely important basis. Second challenge really here is the fact that there is still a lack of political commitment to address the issue. And there is a lot of advocacy to be done to ensure that the problem is understood and taken on board by education authorities. Last year, UNESCO and the United Nations Office for the Prevention of Genocide have organized a global conference of ministers of education to set the basis for international action in the field of education, to establish some overarching objectives. So it has to be considered, education has to be considered as, I would say education against hate speech has to be considered as a subject in its own right in education. So very quickly, I mean, how do you respond to these challenges, to these new challenges? Well, basically it's also by developing new objectives to tackle the problem through education. One, and I would say maybe, I mean, there are four main objectives in our view. One is to provide safe, inclusive, hate-free learning environments that are respectful of human rights and supportive of diversity. That's, I would say, a basis in general, not only when one considers hate speech. Second is to try to develop strategies to educate learners of all ages about what is hate speech in ways that highlights the link between verbal attacks against groups and physical violence. The role of hate speech in violent extremist narratives has to be understood, as well as the potential for hateful propaganda to fuel violence, conflict, and sometimes atrocity crimes such as genocide. There's a need for more awareness on that. Third is really to help young people become critical thinkers and develop a capacity for dialogue, in particular intercultural dialogue, that will help them to recognize and reject this kind of dehumanizing propaganda and disinformation that you can find online. And fourth, it's about enabling young people, and we've said it already, to navigate online environments safely and responsibly. In other words, and I will finish on that, addressing hate speech through education is not only a technical task that has to be added to the academic learning process and like any other subject, but it's really part of a broader socialization process of education. It relates to identity formation. It relates to inclusive diversity. It relates to community building. So that's why education is really important.
Thank you so much, Carol, really, because I think this is, everybody speaks about the, of all the benefits, which I think are great on the applications of AI in education, but it's so important to do these deep reflections about what education means and what does it mean in this new area with these new challenges. So thank you so much for this. Now, I told you, I mean, I was a very bad and beneficent moderator in the first round, and I will be cruel in the second because we have like 12 minutes to finish. So if you agree with me, I will be a bit more flexible in the order that we had. And the main objective of the second round is for each of the speakers to try to identify basically actors who need to be responsible to take actions. Because with AI, the roles of those who are responsible have been partially redefined. Legislators, intermediate bodies, educators, as we just heard, and all of individuals. So I will ask you in really 3 minutes. I will pose you the question, but also if you can finalize, not only with the response, but with a take-home message, with a concrete recommendation on how we can move forward the agenda. And Peter Paul, maybe very briefly, you can tell us because the recommendation, and you were in fact a member of the independent experts that drafted the recommendation. And in this recommendation is the emphasis is that ethical guidance of AI systems need to be put in place by member states. So what role can ethical guidelines play in the fight against racism and discrimination, and which AI actors could benefit from these ethical guidelines, and how can we move forward? 3 minutes, please, maximum.
I will not use more than 3 minutes. Super important question. So I think indeed, if you look at the recommendation text, then governments, of course, have a central role, not only by deploying AI systems themselves in an ethical way, but also by organizing a process in which the design, the implementation, and the use of AI systems can be done in a responsible way. And I think that very concept of, you could say responsibility is maybe the key word in dealing with AI systems. AI even disrupts what we can mean by responsibility. And since AI systems themselves seem to take on a kind of responsibility, have a kind of autonomy, as it were, I think the important thing to do is to identify what the AI systems are doing, what the humans can do, and how humans, together with AI systems, can take care of a more responsible world. So that means that in the design, in the implementation, and in the use of these systems, we need to make sure that the hybrid intelligence, if you want, where the artificial intelligence is connected to the human intelligence, takes on a good role. So that means designing AI systems in an ethical way, avoiding biases, training them with the right data sets. It means implementing them with an eye on the potential biases that they could have, the potential discrimination, that is in the systems, and also making sure that users are empowered, have the ability to read and to understand what AI systems are doing in our society. I think that's what we should do. And that is how all the fields in which AI systems work and all the domains of values that are identified in the recommendation can come to life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter Paul. I will be juggling a little bit only with the order. And since we are speaking about concrete actors, I would turn now to Emma. And if you can please share with us your experience in working with legislators, because they play a crucial role in AI governance. So through your center, if you can tell us about your experience and the take-home message, please.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the time as well. So just to explain what the Institute of AI is, it's a global cross-parliamentary forum on emerging technology. So we have found that actually legislators want to be educated in this. They don't necessarily understand that inputs will drive outputs, but also we are really busy as countries acting in silos, education department dealing, in one silo, separate to health, and they don't look over the overall piece and see how digital transformation, which is every government's drive, is actually adopting technologies that nudge people to behave in a certain way or make decisions on previous data. And so what we have been doing is working with legislators to equip them to ask questions in their parliaments, and we're delighted to be working with UNESCO on this. From our perspective, the UNESCO recommendation is the North Star on setting standards for ethics in this area. There are 193 countries signed up, and we are working with UNESCO to see how we can help legislators through toolkits implement laws or ask questions that will protect people. There was a very good example during COVID around, in the UK, an algorithm was used to decide exam results. The exam results would determine whether someone would go to university or not. The algorithm that was used meant that schools that were fee-paying, that students there were preferred and got higher results than schools that weren't fee-paying because it was done on historical data. Now, of course, the outcome was that this algorithm was highly racist and discriminatory because these poorer areas, these poor children were actually deprived. It was tremendous because we had young people in the streets with placards, screaming against the algorithm in the UK, and that is my overriding message to everyone. We have this deference to tech. We assume that because the technology gives us an answer, that must be right. We need to question it, and we need to give people the tools to question it, because where we will be is that the AI will compound the inequities of the past, and we have to be able to question and scrutinize, and that's what we're doing through the Institute with our legislators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma.
3 minutes as well.
Yes, excellent. Thank you so much. So now, with the challenge of the 3 minutes, María Elena, mucha gente considera, I'm going to give you the time. Mucha gente considera esta idea de que las tecnologías son neutrales, entonces que también la inteligencia artificial es neutral. La recomendación claramente se opone a este concepto. Entonces sería muy importante también en estos 3 minutos si tú nos pudieras ayudar a identificar quiénes son estos actores que tienen que estar involucrados para evitar que se perpetúe y se haga todavía más fuerte el racismo y la discriminación en todo el ciclo vital. Gracias.
Gracias. Bueno, los actores que tienen que estar involucrados son los que participan en cualquier etapa del ciclo de la inteligencia artificial, y desde la decisión de hacer un sistema, generar los datos, procesarlos, diseñar los algoritmos, probarlos, aplicarlos, incluso hasta la terminación. Cuando se termina el sistema ya no se va a poder usar. ¿Qué se hace con él, con los datos, con todo lo que se obtuvo? Y pues entonces se trata de un proceso que debe ser muy incluyente y además que dentro de estos actores también haya una participación diversa, una representación diversa de todos los grupos de la sociedad para que se tomen en cuenta sus perspectivas, sus necesidades, sus condiciones. Esto es lo que llamaría también una inclusión por diseño, no esperar que surja espontáneamente un sistema incluyente, sino que tiene que ser un objetivo y un criterio de diseño. Y para eso necesitamos no solamente esta participación diversa, sino contar con criterios, procesos y metodologías para que se generen sistemas incluyentes. Y por último, un enfoque sistémico. No es nada más generar partes separadas, sino que tiene que haber una vinculación entre todos estos grupos para que el enfoque sea sistémico, que todo lo que se hace en cada parte del ciclo de vida refuerce el objetivo de la inclusión.
Excelente. Muchísimas gracias por muy buena respuesta y por muy concisa y a tiempo. Now I will turn to Carl, because since we're trying to identify concrete actors, so what do you think, because the UNESCO recommendation says that member states should promote educational programs on the impact of AI systems on human rights and their implications. So what strategies should education policymakers develop to better prepare learners to reject hate speech, but most importantly, to engage as responsible citizens online, which is basically probably the answer to your previous intervention of what are the problems, now how we solve them, who should to solve them.
Very, very quickly, I would suggest 4 concrete suggestions for education policymakers. The first one is to foster global citizenship education and strengthen awareness for human rights and civil responsibilities, while considering, of course, the digital dimension of citizenship as well. And this includes trying to consider the nexus between addressing hate speech and upholding freedom of expression, to raising awareness of how illegitimate violations differ from legally permitted limitations. Second is to try to build understanding of the causes and consequences of hate speech through history education, through citizenship education, through very concrete and context-specific examples of how hate speech and discriminations have served as the precursors of genocide, for instance, and UNESCO has developed programs relating to genocide education and advocates for that. We advocate also for the possibility of looking at local violent past and try to build bridges between international and local context so learners can understand the lessons and of how hate speech erodes democratic structures and may end up into mass violence. 3, it's about trying to incorporate in education system multiple perspectives and to try to promote pluralism and critical thinking. So it's about respectful learning environment. It's about revising aspects of the curriculum, revising educational materials. It's about, and this is not done enough, developing social competences, such as empathy or compassion and conflict resolution skills. And 4th, and that's really extremely important, and we've said it again and again, is to promote media and information literacy, including about artificial intelligence, in order to develop socially responsible attitudes, including in the digital world. So my last word is going to be invest in education, but not any kind of education when it comes to that. We want an education that fosters a positive sense of identity, that is inclusive, that supports responsible civic engagement in society, but also online, and that is based on human rights. And I think without this, all other measures will be difficult to implement.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I still need to give the floor to two more panelists, and we have 0 minutes, so the shorter you can be, the better. So Guillermo, maybe you can say, because you're already working on this in UNESCO, so what exactly do you do? I mean, the actors that you are involved with and how they relate to this recommendation. Please do it in 1 minute and a half, so then we can ask Ames to tell us how the recommendation of AI can be used in her context, and then we can finish the panel, because I have 0, 0, 0, 0. Thank you.
No worries. Very briefly, I mean, in the same general conference that the AI ethics recommendation was approved, the 193 member states of UNESCO also endorsed the principles of the Windhoek +30 declaration that tries to organize the information as a public good in this digital ecosystem. And when we have information as a public good, is precisely to avoid the idea that the content is a public harm, including hate speech or racism and discrimination. So there are 3 elements here that are very important. One, Karel already spoke. We need to qualify the demand for an information that respects this idea of public good. So media and information literacy, education, everything Karel said. The other thing is that we need to provide the content. So it's not only about the demand, it's about the offer. So the supply of quality information, and this is about it's about fostering or enhancing the systems that produce quality content, journalists, teachers, scientists, think tanks, and so on. So we need to enhance the supply. But there is a third element, that is the transmission chain. For instance, the social media companies, the tech companies. And here we need to pay a lot of attention on that. And there are key discussions. For instance, these systems should be more transparent because we don't actually know what's happening. And therefore, it's very difficult to produce evidence-based public policy. So that's why, and I finish with this to not go long, that UNESCO next February the Director General is convening a global debate about the co-regulation of these internet platforms so that we can understand better what needs to be done for, at the same time, protect information as a public good and protecting freedom of expression in the digital space. So I'll stop here, but I think this is very much connected with the key values of the recommendation.
Thank you so much, Guillermo. Ames, please, it will be a fantastic way of closing our panel. If you can help us thinking about who should be responsible to use the recommendation of UNESCO to fight racism and anti-discrimination.
Thank you, Daphne.
But please, in 1 minute and a half, because they will kill me, the organizers.
Okay. I think it's everyone's responsibility. It's a shared responsibility. And I think all relevant aspects of the UNESCO AI recommendations need to be used to inform policies for AI. And this is important because policies must be informed by ethics. And I think in terms of who should be responsible, our recommendation actually points out all the actors: researchers, programmers, engineers, data scientists, end users, business enterprises, universities, public and private entities, civil societies, etc. But each of these actors have to factor in ethical and human rights aspects to safeguard against the scourge of racism being introduced into AI. These recommendations should also be used, and it's already been said, at the level of education, basic, secondary, and tertiary education levels, and especially in countries where racism is very rife, like the context that I come from. However, a parting shot. Most important is not only that the state ensures that these recommendations are built into policy documents, but also that the policies must not remain in the documents in cyberspace, having arrived there, or on shelves gathering dust. As we see with most documents, implementation of regulations is a huge problem. These regulations must be implemented. Our recommendations, UNESCO recommendations for AI, has very structured way of how we should do monitoring. So we need monitoring as well.
Thank you
And
so
over
much.
to you, Daphne.
Thank you so much. I think that's exactly what we should do. And please just join me all in thanking the panelists and give them all a very warm applause. They were all excellent, and I really apologize for the next panel, but please stay here, and thank you so much to all.
Thank you.